For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of this darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. And that is from Ephesians 6, verse 12. For quite some time now, there has been talk of infiltration of fifth columnists into the Catholic Church. Now, many people may wish to dismiss that idea as a conspiracy theory, but historically, there have been many Catholics, including popes, who were aware of the plan to subvert the Church and who did all that they could to stop it. You're listening to Genesis 3:15. I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel. I'm Mariana Bartold, the author of Fatima, The Signs and Secrets, and Guadalupe, Secrets of the Image, both which are available at Amazon. In 1999, my friend and colleague, John Vennari, may God rest his soul, sent me a booklet that was then recently published. It was adapted from a previous work of John's, which was published only 2 years prior. The booklet is entitled The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a Masonic Blueprint for the Subversion of the Catholic Church. Considering the current reactions of Catholics to Pope Francis's recent issue of his motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, this seems like the right time to revisit John's work. John's booklet highlighted vital excerpts from a written work of the Freemasons. You might have previously read John's booklet, or you might have first heard about it around 2017 from Taylor Marshall, who in one of his podcasts did mention John's booklet. It seems apparent then that at some point, Taylor Marshall became familiar with the work of the contemporary traditionalists like John and those before him. John was careful to footnote his work, which includes references to popes like Gregory XVI, Pius IX, Leo XIII, as well as the great theologian Cardinal Juan de Torquemada, Cretaineau-Joly, Dr. Rudolph Graber, Monsignor George E. Dillon, Father Dennis Fahey, Reverend E. Cahill, Frere Michel of the Holy Trinity, Michael Davies, Paul VI, Father Joseph Ratzinger, and a few others. In this podcast, I will share with you John's work because, by the grace of God, it is upon his shoulders and those before him to whom we owe this pertinent information as we continue, as soldiers of the Church militant, to stand fast and hold fast to the traditions we have learned either by word or by epistle, as St. Paul taught, as we battle for the preservation of the traditional Catholic faith and the traditional Catholic Mass. By the way, to ensure you don't miss any of my new podcasts, make sure to give this episode a thumbs up, and then please, if you have not done so already, subscribe to Genesis 3:15. And for those two actions, I sincerely thank you. I will begin by quoting John's work, The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, from the beginning. Quote, few Catholics know of the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a secret document written in the early 19th century that mapped out a blueprint for the subversion of the Catholic Church. The Alta Vendita was the highest lodge of the Carabinieri, an Italian secret society with links to Freemasonry, and which, along with Freemasonry, was condemned by the Catholic Church. Father E. Cahill, S.J., in his book Freemasonry and the Anti-Christian Movement, states that the Alta Vendita was, quote, commonly supposed to have been at the time the governing center of European Freemasonry, unquote. The Carabinieri were most active in Italy and France. In his book, Athanasius and the Church of Our Time, Bishop Rudolph Graber quoted a Freemason who declared that, quote, the goal is no longer the destruction of the Church, but to make use of it by infiltrating it. In other words, since Freemasonry cannot completely obliterate Christ's Church, it plans not only to eradicate the influence of Catholicism in society, but also to use the Church's structure as an instrument of renewal, progress, and enlightenment to further many of its own principles and goals. The strategy advanced in the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita is astonishing in its audacity and cunning. From the start, the document tells of a process that will take decades to accomplish. Those who drew up the document knew that they would not see its fulfillment. They were inaugurating a work that would be carried on by succeeding generations of the initiated. The Permanent Instruction says, quote, in our ranks, the soldier dies and the struggle goes on, unquote. The instruction called for the dissemination of liberal ideas and axioms throughout society and within the institutions of the Catholic Church, so that laity, seminarians, clerics, and prelates would, over the years, gradually be imbued with progressive principles. In time, this mindset would be so pervasive that priests would be ordained, bishops would be consecrated, and cardinals would be nominated whose thinking was in step with the modern thought rooted in the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and other principles of 1789, like equality of religions, separation of church and state, religious pluralism, etc. Eventually, a pope would be elected from these ranks who would lead the church on the path of enlightenment and renewal. They stated that it was not their aim to place a Freemason on the chair of Peter. Their goal was to effect an environment that would eventually produce a pope and a hierarchy won over to the ideas of liberal Catholicism, all the while believing themselves to be faithful Catholics. These Catholic leaders, then, would no longer oppose the modern ideas of the Revolution, as had been the consistent practice of the popes from 1789 until 1958, the death of Pope Pius XII, who condemned these liberal principles, but would amalgate them into the Church. The end result would be a Catholic clergy and laity marching under the banner of the Enlightenment, all the while thinking they are marching under the banner of the Apostolic Keys. For those who may believe this scheme to be too far-fetched, a goal too hopeless for the enemy to attain, it should be noted that both Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII asked that the permanent instruction be published, no doubt in order to prevent such a tragedy from taking place. However, if such a dark state of affairs would ever come to pass, there would obviously be three unmistakable means of recognizing it. 1. It would produce an upheaval of such magnitude that the entire world would realize that there had been a major revolution inside the Catholic Church in line with modern ideas. It would be clear to all that an updating had taken place. Number 2, a new theology would be introduced that would be in contradiction to previous teachings. And number 3, the Freemasons themselves would voice their cockadoodle of triumph, believing that the Catholic Church had finally seen the light on such points as equality of religions, the secular state, pluralism, and whatever other compromises had been achieved. The secret papers of the Alta Vendita that fell into the hands of Pope Gregory XVI embrace a period that goes from 1820 to 1846. And on a related note, I will add that those years are very important because both Our Lady and our Lord appeared to different people to give them important messages for that time and for the future. For example, in 1830, Our Lady appeared to Saint Catherine Labouré to warn her of future dangers to France and to also give the sacramental that we know as the Miraculous Medal. In 1842, she appeared to another sister to give her the Badge of the Immaculate Heart, which is commonly known as the Green Scapular. And in 1846, Our Lady appeared once to the children of La Salette, there to give a secret which is still debated to this day. But our Lord also appeared to a nun named Sister Marie de Saint-Pierre, and he gave her the devotion to the Holy Face. He also spoke of the communists, which at that time the public did not even know about yet. All right, to continue about the secret papers of the Alta Vendita, quote, they were published at the request of Pope Pius IX by Cretaineau-Joly in his work, The Roman Church and Revolution, with the brief of approbation of February the 25th, 1861, which he addressed to the author. Pope Pius IX guaranteed the authenticity of these documents, but he did not allow anyone to divulge the true members of the Alta Vendita implicated in this correspondence. The full text of the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita is also contained in Monsignor George E. Dillon's book, Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked. When Pope Leo XIII was presented with a copy of Monsignor Dillon's book, he was so impressed that he ordered an Italian version to be completed and published at his own expense. In the encyclical Humanum Genus of 1884, Leo XIII called upon Catholic leaders to, quote, tear off the mask from Freemasonry and make plain to all what it really is, unquote. The publication of these documents is a means of tearing off the mask. If the popes asked that these letters be published, it's because they wanted all Catholics to know the secret society's plans to subvert the church from within, so that Catholics would be on their guard and hopefully prevent such a catastrophe from taking place. What follows is not the entire instruction, but the sections that are most pertinent to our discussion. The document reads, with emphasis added, quote, our ultimate end is that of Voltaire and of the French Revolution, the final destruction of Catholicism and even of the Christian idea. The Pope, whoever he is, will never come to the secret societies. It is up to the secret societies to take the first step toward the Church with the aim of conquering both of them. The task that we are going to undertake is not the work of a day or of a month or of a year. It may last several years, perhaps a century, but in our ranks the soldier dies and the struggle goes on. We do not intend to win the popes to our cause, to make them neophytes of our principles, propagators of our ideas. That would be a ridiculous dream, and if events turn out in some way, if cardinals or prelates, for example, of their own free will or by surprise, should enter into a part of our secrets, this is not at all an incentive for desiring their elevation to the See of Peter. That elevation would ruin us. Ambition alone would have led them to apostasy. The requirements of power would force them to sacrifice us. What we must ask for, what we should look for and wait for, as the Jews wait for the Messiah, is a pope according to our needs. With that, we shall march more securely towards the assault of the Church than with the pamphlets of our brethren in France and even the gold of England. Do you want to know the reason for this? It is that with this, in order to shatter the high rock on which God has built his church, we no longer need Hannibalian vinegar or need gunpowder or even need our arms. We have the little finger of the successor of Peter engaged in the ploy, and this little finger is as good for this crusade as all the Urban II's and all the St. Bernards in Christendom. We have no doubt that we will arrive at this supreme end of our efforts. But when? But how? The unknown is not yet revealed. Nevertheless, as nothing should turn us aside from the plan drawn up, and on the contrary, everything should tend to this, as if as early as tomorrow success were going to crown the work that is barely sketched, we wish in this instruction, which will remain secret for the mere initiates, to give the officials in the charge of the Supreme Vente, meaning the lodge, some advice that they should instill in all the brethren in the form of instruction or of a memorandum. Now then, to assure ourselves a pope of the required dimensions, it is a question first of shaping for this pope a generation worthy of the reign we are dreaming of. Leave old people and those of a mature age aside. Go to the youth, and if it is possible, even to the children. You will contrive for yourselves, at little cost, a reputation as good Catholics and pure patriots. This reputation will put access to our doctrines into the midst of the young clergy, as well as deeply into the monasteries. In a few years, by the force of things, this young clergy will have overrun all the functions. They will form the sovereign's council. They will be called to choose a pontiff who should reign. And this pontiff, like most of his contemporaries, will be necessarily more or less imbued with the revolutionary Italian and humanitarian principles that we are going to begin to put into circulation. It is a small grain of black mustard that we are entrusting to the ground, but the sunshine of justice will develop it up to the highest power, and you will see one day what a rich harvest this small seed will produce. In the path that we are laying out for our brethren, there are found great obstacles to conquer, difficulties of more than one kind to master. They will triumph over them by experience and by clear-sightedness, but the goal is so splendid that it is important to put all the sails to the wind in order to reach it. You want to revolutionize Italy? Look for the Pope whose portrait we have just drawn. You wish to establish the reign of the chosen ones on the throne of the prostitute of Babylon? Let the clergy march under your standard, always believing that they are marching under the banner of the apostolic keys. You intend to make the last vestige of tyrants and the oppressors disappear? Lay your snares, meaning their nets, like Simon Bar-Jonah. Lay them in the sacristies, the seminaries, and the monasteries, rather than at the bottom of the sea. And if you do not hurry, we promise you a catch more miraculous than his. The fisher of fish became the fisher of men. You will bring friends around the apostolic chair. You will have preached a revolution in Tierra and in Cope, marching with the cross and the banner, a revolution that will need to be only a little bit urged on to set fire to the four corners of the world." Unquote. And now to continue with John's words, it now remains for us to examine how successful this design has been. Throughout the 19th century, society had become increasingly permeated with the liberal principles of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, to the great detriment of the Catholic faith and the Catholic state. The supposedly kinder and gentler notions of religious pluralism, religious indifferentism, a democracy which believes all authority comes from the people, false notions of liberty, separation of church and state, interfaith gatherings, and other novelties were gripping the minds of post-Enlightenment Europe, infecting statesmen and churchmen alike. The popes of the 19th century and early 20th century waged war against these dangerous trends in full battle dress. With clear-sighted presence of mind rooted in an uncompromised certitude of faith, these popes were not taken in. They knew that evil principles, no matter how honorable they may appear, cannot bear good fruit, and these were evil principles at their worst, since they were rooted not only in heresy but in apostasy. Like commanding generals who recognized the duty to hold their ground at all costs, these popes aimed powerful cannons at the errors of the modern world and fired incessantly. The encyclicals were their cannonballs, and they never missed their target. The most devastating blast came in the form of Pope Pius IX's monumental 1864 Syllabus of Errors, and when the smoke cleared, all involved in the battle were in no doubt as to who was on what side. The lines of demarcation had clearly been drawn. In this great syllabus, Pius IX condemned the principal errors of the modern world, not because they were modern, but because these new ideas were rooted in pantheistic naturalism and were therefore incompatible with Catholic doctrine, as well as being destructive to society. The teachings in the syllabus were counter-liberalism, and the principles of liberalism were counter-syllabus. This was unquestionably recognized by all parties. Father Denis Fahey referred to this showdown as Pius IX versus the pantheistic deification of man. Speaking for the other side, the French Freemason Ferdinand Bousson likewise declared, quote, "A school cannot remain neutral between the syllabus and the Declaration of the Rights of Man," unquote. Yet the 19th century saw a new breed of Catholic who utopianly sought a compromise between the two. These men looked for what they believed to be good in the principles of 1789 and tried to introduce them into the church. Many clergymen, infected by the spirit of the age, were caught into this net that had been, quote, cast into the sacristies and into the seminaries, unquote. They came to be known as liberal Catholics. Pope Pius IX remarked that they were the worst enemies of the Church. Despite this, their numbers increased. This crisis peaked around the beginning of the 20th century when the liberalism of 1789 that had been blowing in the wind swirled into the tornado of modernism. Father Vincent Micheli identified this heresy as such by describing modernism's trinity of parents. He wrote, 1. Its religious ancestor is the Protestant Reformation. Number 2, its philosophical parent is the Enlightenment. And number 3, its political pedigree comes from the French Revolution. Pope St. Pius X, who ascended to the papal chair in 1903, recognized modernism as a most deadly plague that must be arrested. He wrote that the most important obligation of the Pope is to ensure the purity and integrity of Catholic doctrine, and he further stated that if he did nothing, then he would have failed in his essential duty. St. Pius X waged a war on modernism, issued an encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, and a syllabus, Lamentabili, against it, instituted the anti-modernist oath to be sworn by all priests and theology teachers, purged the seminaries and universities of modernists, and excommunicated the stubborn and unrepentant. St. Pius X effectively halted the spread of modernism in his day. It is reported, however, that when he was congratulated for having eradicated this grave error, St. Pius X immediately responded that despite all his efforts, he had not succeeded in killing this beast, but had only driven it underground. He warned that if church leaders were not vigilant, it would return in the future more virulent than ever. A little-known drama that unfolded during the reign of Pope Pius XI demonstrates that the underground current of modernist thought was alive and well in the immediate post-Pius X period. Father Raymond Dulac relates that at the secret consistory of May 23, 1923, Pope Pius XI questioned the 30 cardinals of the Curia on the timeliness of summoning an ecumenical council. In attendance were such illustrious prelates as Cardinals Merideval, Delay, Gaspari, Borgiani, and Billot. The cardinals advised against it. Cardinal Billot warned, quote, "The existence of profound differences in the midst of the episcopacy itself cannot be concealed. They run the risk of giving place to discussions that will be prolonged indefinitely," unquote. Boggiani recalled the modernist theories from which he said a part of the clergy and of the bishops were not exempt. Quote, this mentality can incline certain fathers to present motions to introduce methods incompatible with Catholic traditions, unquote. Billot was even more precise. He expressed his fear of seeing the council maneuvered by, quote, the worst enemies of the church, the modernists, who are already getting ready, as certain indications show, to bring forth the revolution in the church, a new 1789, unquote. In discouraging the idea of a council for such reasons, these cardinals showed themselves more apt at recognizing the signs of the times than all the post-Vatican II theologians combined. Yet their caution may have been rooted in something deeper. They may also have been haunted by the writings of the infamous Illumine, the excommunicated Canon Roca, who lived from 1830 to 1893, who preached revolution and church, quote, reform, unquote, and who predicted a subversion of the church that would be brought about by a council. In his book, Athanasius and the Church of Our Time, Bishop Graber refers to Canon Roca's prediction of a new enlightened church which would be influenced by, quote, the socialism of Jesus and the apostles, unquote. In the mid-19th century, Roca had predicted, quote, the new church, which might not be able to retain anything of scholastic doctrine and the original form of the former church, will nevertheless receive consecration and canonical jurisdiction from Rome, unquote. Bishop Graber, commenting on this prediction, remarked, quote, a few years ago, this was still inconceivable to us, but today, unquote. Canon Roca also predicted a liturgical, quote, reform, unquote. With reference to the future liturgy, he believed, quote, that the divine cult in the form directed by the liturgy, ceremonial, ritual, and regulations of the Roman Church will shortly undergo a transformation at an ecumenical council, which will restore to it the venerable simplicity of the golden age of the apostles in accordance with the dictates of conscience and modern civilization, unquote. He foretold that through this council will come, quote, a perfect accord between the ideals of modern civilization and the ideal of Christ and his gospel. This will be the consecration of the new social order and the solemn baptism of modern civilization, unquote. Roca also spoke of the future of the papacy. He wrote, quote, there is a sacrifice in the offing which represents a solemn act of expiation. The papacy will fall. It will die under the hallowed knife which the fathers of the last council will forge. The papal Caesar is a host, meaning a victim, crowned for the sacrifice, unquote. Roca enthusiastically predicted a new religion, new dogma, new ritual, new priesthood. He called the new priests progressicists. He speaks of the suppression of the soutane, meaning the cassock of the priest, and the marriage of priests. Chilling echoes of Roca and the Alta Vendita are to be found in the words of the Rosicrucian Dr. Rudolph Steiner, who declared in 1910, quote, we need a council and a pope to proclaim it, unquote. Around 1948, Pope Pius XII, at the request of the staunchly Orthodox Cardinal Ruffini, considered calling a general council and even spent a few years making the necessary preparations. There's evidence that progressive elements in Rome eventually dissuaded Pius XII from bringing it to a realization, since this council showed definite signs of being in sync with Humani Generis. Like this great 1950 encyclical, the new council would combat, quote, false opinions which threaten to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine, unquote. Tragically, Pope Pius XII became convinced that he was too advanced in years to shoulder this momentous task, and he resigned himself to the idea that, quote, this will be for my successor, unquote. Throughout the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 until 1958, the Holy Office, under the able leadership of Cardinal Ottaviani, maintained a safe Catholic landscape by keeping the wild horses of modernism firmly corralled. Many of today's modernist theologians disdainfully recount how they and their friends had been muzzled during this period. Yet even Ottaviani could not prevent what was to happen in 1958. A new type of pope, quote, whom the progressivists believed to favor their cause, unquote, would ascend to the pontifical chair and would force a reluctant Ottaviani to remove the latch, open the corral, and brace himself for the stampede. However, such a state of affairs was not unforeseen. At the news of the death of Pius XII, the old Dom Lambert Baudouin, a friend of Cardinal Roncalli, the future John XXIII, confided to Father Louis Boyer, quote, if they elect Roncalli, everything would be saved. He would be capable of calling a council and of consecrated ecumenism, unquote. And so it happened. Cardinal Roncalli was elected and called a council which consecrated ecumenism. The revolution in Tierra and Cope was underway. It is well known and superbly documented that a clique of liberal theologians, periti, and bishops hijacked Vatican Council II, which took place between 1962 and 1965, with an agenda to remake the church into their own image through the implementation of a new theology. Critics and defenders of Vatican II are in agreement on this point. In his book, Vatican II Revisited, Bishop Aloysius J. Wisislo, a rhapsodic advocate of the Vatican II revolution, declares with enthusiasm that, quote, theologians and biblical scholars who had been under a cloud for years surfaced as periti, meaning theological experts advising the bishops at the council, and their post-Vatican II books and commentaries became popular reading, unquote. He notes that, quote, Pope Pius XII encyclical Humani Generis of 1950 had a devastating effect on the work of a number of pre-conciliar theologians, and explains that during the early preparation of the council, those theologians, mainly French with some Germans, whose activities had been restricted by Pope Pius XII, were still under a cloud. Pope John quietly lifted the ban, affecting some of the most influential ones, yet a number remained suspect to the officials of the Holy Office, unquote. Bishop Wisislo sings the praises of triumphant progressives such as Hans Küng, Karl Rahner, John Courtney Mary, Yves Congar, Henry de Lubac, Edward Schillebeck, and Gregory Baum, who had been considered suspect before the council, but who are now the leading lights of post-Vatican II theology. In effect, those whom Pope Pius XII considered unfit to be walking the streets of Catholicism were now in control of the town, and as if to crown their achievements, the oath against modernism was quietly suppressed shortly after the close of the council. St. Pius X had predicted correctly. Lack of vigilance in authority had allowed modernism to return with a vengeance. There were countless battles at Vatican II between the international group of fathers who fought to maintain tradition and the progressivist Rhine group. Tragically, in the end, it was the latter, the liberal and modernist element, that prevailed. It was obvious to anyone who had eyes to see that the council opened the door to many ideas that had formerly been anathema to church teaching, but which are in step with modernist thought. This did not happen by accident, but by design. The progressives at Vatican II avoided condemnations of modernist errors. They also deliberately planned ambiguities in the council's text, which they intended to exploit after the council. These ambiguities have been utilized to promote an ecumenism that had been condemned by Pope Pius XI, a religious liberty that had been condemned by the 19th and earliest 20th century popes, especially Pope Pius IX, a new liturgy along the lines of ecumenism that Archbishop Bonini called, quote, a major conquest of the Catholic Church, unquote, a collegiality that strikes at the heart of the papal primacy, and a new attitude toward the world, especially in one of the most radical of all the council documents, Gaudium et Spes. As the authors of the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita had hoped, the notions of liberal culture had finally won adherents among major players in the Catholic hierarchy and were thus spread throughout the entire church. The result has been an unprecedented crisis of faith, which continues to worsen. At the same time, countless highly placed churchmen, obviously inebriated by the spirit of Vatican II, continuously praise those post-conciliar reforms that have brought this calamity to pass. Yet, not only many of our church leaders, but also Freemasons celebrate this turn of events. They rejoice that Catholics have finally seen the light, since it appears that many of their Masonic principles have been sanctioned by the Church. Yves Marcedon of the Scottish Rite, in his book Ecumenism Viewed by a Traditional Freemason, praised the ecumenism nurtured at Vatican II. He said, quote, Catholics must not forget that all roads lead to God, and they will have to accept that this courageous idea of free thinking, which we can really call a revolution, pouring forth from our Masonic lodges, has spread magnificently over the dome of St. Peter's, unquote. The post-Vatican II spirit of doubt and revolution obviously warmed the heart of French Freemason Jacques Mitterrand, who wrote approvingly, quote, "Something has changed within the Church, and replies given by the Pope to the most urgent questions, such as priestly celibacy and birth control, are hotly debated within the Church itself. The word of the Sovereign Pontiff is questioned by bishops, by priests, by the faithful. For a Freemason, a man who questions dogma is already a Freemason without an apron," unquote. Marcel Prelot, a senator for the Doubs region in France, goes much further in describing what has taken place. He writes, quote, "We had struggled for a century and a half to bring our opinions to prevail within the Church and had not succeeded. Finally, there came Vatican II, and we triumphed. From then on, the propositions and principles of liberal Catholicism have been definitively and officially accepted by Holy Church," unquote. Prelot's statement deserves comment, since we must make the distinction between the Church and churchmen. Despite any claims by Freemasons, it's impossible for doctrinal errors to be, quote, "definitively and officially accepted by Holy Church," unquote, as such. The Church, the mystical body of Christ, cannot fall into error. Our Lord promised that, quote, "the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," unquote. And that's from Matthew 16, verse 18. But this does not mean that churchmen, even at the highest levels, cannot be infected with the liberal spirit of the age and promote ideas and practices that are opposed to the Church's perennial magisterium. Those, quote, "conservatives," unquote, who deny that various points of Vatican II constitute a break with tradition and with the previous magisterial pronouncements, at least by ambiguity, implications, and omissions, have failed to listen to the very movers and shakers of the Council who shamelessly acknowledge this. Yves Congar, one of the artisans of the Reform, remarked with quiet satisfaction that, quote, "the Church has had peacefully its October Revolution," unquote. And by the way, in case you don't know what that means, he was speaking about the Communist Revolution, which began with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The same Father Yves Congar stated that Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Liberty is contrary to the syllabus of Pope Pius IX. Regarding Article 2 of the Declaration on Religious Liberty, he said, quote, "It cannot be denied that a text like this does materially say something different from the syllabus of 1864, and even almost the opposite of Propositions 15 and 77 through 79 of that document," unquote. Lastly, some years ago, Cardinal Ratzinger, apparently unruffled by the admission, wrote that he sees the Vatican II text Gaudium et Spes as a counter-syllabus. He wrote, quote, "If it is desirable to offer a diagnosis of the text," again, Gaudium et Spes, "as a whole, we might say that in conjunction with the texts on religious liberty and world religions, it is a revision of the syllabus of Pius IX, a kind of counter-syllabus. Let us be content to say here that the text serves as a counter-syllabus and as such represents on the part of the Church an attempt at an official reconciliation with the new era inaugurated in 1789, unquote. The new era inaugurated in 1789 consists in effect in the elevation of the rights of man above the rights of God. In truth, this comment by Cardinal Ratzinger is disturbing, especially since it came from the man who, as head of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, is now in charge of guarding the purity of Catholic doctrine. But we can also cite a similar statement by the progressive Cardinal Suenens, himself a council father, who spoke in terms of old regimes that have come to an end. The words he used in praise of the council are the most telling, the most chilling, and the most damning. Suenens declared, quote, "Vatican II is the French Revolution in the Church," unquote. For years, Catholics have labored under the mistaken notion that they must accept the Pastoral Council, Vatican II, with the same assent of faith that they owe to dogmatic councils. This, however, is not the case. The Council Fathers repeatedly referred to Vatican II as a pastoral council, a council which dealt not with defining the faith, but with implementing it. The fact that Vatican II is inferior to a dogmatic council is confirmed by the testimony of Council Father Bishop Thomas Morris, which at his request text was not unsealed until after his death. And he said, quote, "I was relieved when we were told that this council was not aiming at defining or giving final statements on doctrine, because a statement on doctrine has to be very carefully formulated, and I would have regarded the council documents as tentative and liable to be reformed," unquote. At the close of Vatican II, the bishops asked the council's Secretary General, Archbishop Pericles Felici, for that which theologians call the theological note of the council, that is, the doctrinal weight of Vatican II's teachings. Felici replied, quote, "We have to distinguish according to the schemas and the chapters those which have already been the subject of dogmatic definitions in the past. As for the declarations which have a novel character, we have to make reservations," unquote. After the close of Vatican II, Paul VI gave this explanation, quote, "There are those who ask what authority, what theological qualification the Council intended to give to its teachings, knowing that it avoided issuing solemn dogmatic definitions engaging the infallibility of the ecclesiastical magisterium. The answer is known by whoever remembers the Conciliar Declaration of March 6, 1964, repeated on November 16, 1964. Given the Council's pastoral character, it avoided pronouncing in an extraordinary manner dogmas endowed with the note of infallibility," unquote. In other words, unlike a dogmatic council, Vatican II does not demand an unqualified assent of faith. Vatican II's verbose and ambiguous statements are not on a par with dogmatic pronouncements. Hence, Vatican II's novelties are not unconditionally binding on the faithful. Catholics may make reservations and even resist any teachings from the Council that would conflict with the perennial magisterium of the centuries. The post-Vatican II revolution bears all the hallmarks of the fulfilling of the designs of the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, as well as the prophecies of Canon Roca. Number 1, the entire world has witnessed a profound change within the Catholic Church on an international scale, a change that is in step with the modern world. Number 2, Vatican II's defenders and detractors both demonstrate that certain doctrinal orientations of and since the Council constitute a break with the past. Number 3, the Freemasons themselves rejoice that, thanks to the Council, their ideas, quote, have spread magnificently over the dome of St. Peter's, unquote. Thus, the passion that our Holy Church is presently suffering is no great mystery. By recklessly ignoring the popes of the past, our present church leaders have erected a compromised structure that is collapsing upon itself. Though Pope Paul VI lamented that, quote, the Church is in a state of auto-demolition, unquote, he, like the present pontificate, insisted that the disastrous aggiornamento responsible for this auto-demolition be continued full steam. In the face of such diabolical disorientation, the term that Fatima's Sister Lucia employed to describe the present mindset of many in today's hierarchy, the only response for all Catholics concerned is 1. To pray much, especially the Rosary. 2. To learn and live the traditional doctrine and morals of the Catholic Church as found in pre-Vatican II Catholic writings. 3. To adhere to the Latin Tridentine Mass where the Catholic faith and devotion are found in their fullness, unaffected by today's ecumenism. Number 4, to resist with all one's soul the liberal post-Vatican II trends wreaking havoc on the mystical body of Christ. 5, to instruct others charitably in the traditions of the faith and warn them of the errors of the times. And 6, to pray that a contagious return to sanity may sweep through a sufficient number of the hierarchy. 7, to put great confidence in Our Lady and her power to reorient our church leaders back to Catholic tradition. And 8, never to compromise. Since this present struggle is essentially a supernatural battle, we must not ignore the supernatural helps given to us at Fatima in 1917. All concerned Catholics should faithfully fulfill the requests of Our Lady of Fatima and especially pray and work toward the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This will be the key to destroying, quote, the errors of Russia, unquote, not only in Russia, but worldwide, including within the Church. For in the promised triumph of the Immaculate Heart, the unrepentant agents of liberalism, modernism, and naturalism will all be gathered in a great ecumenical gathering with the Prince of this world to receive the communal head crushing from the heel of the Queen of Heaven. Thank you for listening to Genesis 3:15 today. And before I close, I would only ask you to remember in your prayers the soul of John Vennari and the souls of all the former fighters for the Church and the Catholic Mass. And so, my friends, until the next time, may God bless you, and may Our Lady Mary keep you and yours under her starry mantle. Salve Regina.